Due to the eerie and graphic nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. The Kirkendall family lived in Firecrest, Washington, and lived a perfectly normal life. Well, as normal as a household can be. But soon, things would change. It started with one of their daughters, 16-year-old Courtney, who began experiencing something strange going on with her cell phone. It started sending text messages out on its own. At first, it may have been ignored or treated as something like a glitch, maybe something was wrong with the device or with their cell phone service. But soon, they would start receiving phone calls from someone with a scratchy voice, from a restricted phone number. The calls talked about what the family was doing or mentioning what they were wearing. The family became victim to one of the most famous cases of stalking, which at the time baffled investigators. Today, we'll look at several cases of stalking, along with the Phone Stalker and the famous case of the Watcher. My name is Edwin. Here is a dark memory. Andrea McKay was inside her own home on a day just like any other. She grabbed a few lemons and went over the kitchen counter and took out the cutting board and a knife. Her mind wandered, as it always did, when suddenly, the phone rang. She picked it up and held it up to her ear, and a raspy voice told her that it preferred lemons. Now, the strange thing here is that Andrea McKay was a neighbor to the Kirkendall family, and now her and her family would become victims to the Phone Stalker. The Kirkendall family contacted the police after they started receiving the strange phone calls, and they were able to demonstrate how the phone would send messages, turn on, and change the ringtone all by itself. The police decided to trace the phone calls, so they set up the trap and waited. Soon enough, another call would come in from the Phone Stalker. And when they found the source of the call, they discovered that it was made from the family's phones, even when the phones were turned off. Yet the worst was yet to come. The phone call started to escalate, now with threats, saying that they were going to die, that they hate them, that they are going to get murdered, that everyone they knew would get murdered, that their pets would not be an exception to this. And even their neighbors, the McKays, received more calls, with one of them saying that there was going to be a school shooting. And it must have been the same person, though some of the calls that the Kirkendalls received were not from a scratchy voice, but rather recordings of private family conversations. So the family changed the phones, they changed phone numbers, but nothing worked. For approximately 4 long months, the family had to deal with this. And yet, to this day, nobody really knows what happened. Some people believe that this was a prank that got carried away, or a hoax. The family now keeps a very low profile on social media, and even now, nobody knows if the culprit was ever caught. No charges were ever pressed. And from the entire ordeal, we have a quote from the Phone Stalker and one of his infamous threats. "I know where you are. I know where you live. I'm going to kill you." Derek and Maria Broaddus and their 3 children had just moved into their dream house, a $1.3 million home located at 657 Boulevard, Westfield, New Jersey. However, this excitement would not live for long. While they were moving in, they received a creepy note in their mail. Part of the letter reads, "I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be." The letter continued, "Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. The letter was signed, however. Signed by the Watcher. The letters they were receiving only kept getting worse, with phrases like, "Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me." And also things like, "Did 657 Boulevard call you with its force within?" And even more eerie, 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now. And as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. The family never finished moving into the place, since the letters were only becoming more terrifying. Plus, within those walls, there was indeed a piece of the puzzle that was missing. You see, 657 Boulevard had a haunted history. In the 1970s, a man by the name of John List had murdered his family in their home. John was an accountant who lived in a mansion with his mother, his wife, and 3 children. The family members were Lutherans, and he even taught at Sunday school. But just like with all good things, this too came to an end. Mr. List lost his job and was so embarrassed that he hid the truth from his family. In order to pay the mortgage, he started to skim money from his mother's account. It was 1971 and the school bus had just left, taking his kids away for the day. He stepped into the house and looked up at his wife Helen, who was having her morning coffee. They exchanged a look. The look that would be their last. He killed her first. He then killed his mother in her own bed. It is hard to imagine what he must have been thinking the rest of that day, with the 2 women who had played such a large role in his life now in a puddle of blood, being soaked up by the floor and a mattress. But then, John did something else. His daughter Patricia, who was 16 years old, got home from school and was shot dead. Soon, his son Frederick, 13 years old, would be arriving. Instead of hiding the evidence, he simply waited for him and then greeted him by taking his life as well. His 15-year-old son had been saved by his own soccer game after school. John went to cheer on him, and as they were driving back home, he took out his gun and shot him in the chest. John then laid their bodies on sleeping bags in the ballroom and covered their faces. He wrote a note to his pastor explaining that he had done it because he was fearful that his family would be corrupted by the evil world and would turn from God. So he did what he could do to help. He cleaned up and cut his picture out from the family photos. He canceled deliveries, told the schools that they were going on vacation. He left the radio on, left the lights on, and then he left the next morning. A month later, the neighbors began to worry. And that's when they found their bodies. 18 years later, his face was on America's Most Wanted on May 21st, 1989, and the search was on. It was then when a woman called him up saying that her neighbor, Robert Clark, looked like him, and it turned out that it was. John List had changed his name. He had moved to Colorado and then Virginia and was charged. He was sentenced to 5 life terms and then died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82. Was the stalker that was harassing the Kirkendall family aware of this? what were his or her intentions? We may never find out. Tatiana Tarasov and Prashanjit Potter met at a New Year's Eve party in 1969, and they shared a friendly kiss. They dated a couple of times, but she made it very clear that she was not interested in him the way that he was interested in her. Prashanjit became obsessed. He continued to try to meet with her and started recording their conversations and replaying them to himself so he could figure out why she rejected him. He would show up at her house and stay with her at the bus stop. He would call her at all times. Prashanjit began to stalk her and became even more depressed. He then saw a psychologist, and he confessed that he wanted to kill Tatiana. The events unfolded in the worst way, with him shooting her with a pellet gun and then stabbing her 14 times. He served 5 years in prison and was then deported to India. Tatiana's family was devastated and sued the psychologist for not intervening after hearing about Prashanjit's intentions. That's what led to the creation of the Tarasov rule, also known as the duty to warn, where mental health professionals have the duty to let someone know if they believe that their client will harm somebody. Laurie Sho and Lisa Michelle Lambert were part of a different case. It was interesting because it involved two high school girls, with one harassing the other back in 1991. Lisa thought that Laurie was trying to steal her boyfriend, when Laurie actually hated the guy. Still, things turned dark. Laurie's mom was holding her own daughter in her arms as she watched her utter the words, "Michelle did it. I love you," and gave in to the multiple stab wounds in a manner far too graphic to describe in this episode. Lisa Michelle Lambert had an accomplice, a 17-year-old named Tabitha Buck, who helped her with the murder. She was released from prison on parole recently, in 2019. Cases of stalkers have changed recently with the introduction of the internet, with one of the first cases on there being the one of Randy Barber and Gary Della Penta. The one categorized as one of the first cyberstalking cases back in 1996. When Randy rejected Gary, he turned to adult chat rooms and posted terrible things about her, along with her address. Randy started receiving disturbing phone calls and even having people showing up at her apartment. Gary was charged with cyberstalking. Stalking, at least the word itself, is used rather loosely in our society, with people saying that they have a stalker and then laughing about it. But to the victims and those affected by stalkers, this is a very serious issue. As we have found out, sometimes they start off and stay as pranks, but can sometimes lead to serious psychological trauma. We may never know who is being affected by it at this very moment due to the seemingly innocent actions of a stalker that are not always classified as harassment. Fortunately, things are changing. See, stalkers seek to terrorize, to harass, due to an obsession or other cruel intentions. And sometimes, they can lead to murder. If you believe that you are being stalked, there are some guidelines you should follow. If you are in imminent danger, call 911. Report it to your local authorities. Document everything as evidence and try to limit contact as much as possible. Let someone know who can help. There are resources available. Some of the ones we found will be in the description of this episode.